tear down your opponent?
Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started. Good morning. Welcome to the Arab Gulf States Institute. My name is Karen Young. I'm a senior resident scholar here. And it's my great pleasure to have Jane Kinninmont here at the Institute. I've known Jane for years, and I think everyone is familiar with her work, and it's not often that she's in Washington, so we thought this is a great opportunity to sort of reflect on both the Saudi Crown Prince's visit to the United Kingdom and now to Washington and East and West Coast and Texas visits through the next week or so. And then I understand there's a visit to France following that. So this is really a world tour. So what are the implications of this diplomacy, of the changes underway in Saudi Arabia in terms of economic transformation? So I'm going to ask Jane to give maybe 10, max 15 minutes of her thoughts on what's at stake. And I'm really pleased that so many of you are here. This is a very well-informed audience. Just so you know, we are on the record. We're also live streaming. But I'd like this to be a conversation. So after Jane speaks, I'll have each of you can say your name, affiliation, and we'll kind of have a bit of a back and forth. So if you're not familiar with Jane, she's the deputy head and senior research fellow of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Previously, she was associate director for the Middle East and Africa for The Economist Group, Middle East and North Africa editor and economist at The Economist Intelligence Unit, and managing editor for the Middle East and Africa at Business Monitor International. She has a BA from Oxford and MSc from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Another kind of logistical note, please silence your cell phones. And you might have noticed in front of you is a survey. We're trying to get feedback on the work that we do here at AGSIW and our website. It's anonymous. We'd appreciate your feedback. You can leave it at your place, or you can hand it in when you leave this morning. But thank you for that. All right, Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, and good morning, everyone. Mohammed bin Salman's visits to the UK and US have obviously attracted a huge amount of attention and publicity to Saudi Arabia and the economic and social changes going on there. But there is still a mismatch in perceptions even when it comes to the economy. MBS is arriving in countries where the dominant domestic perception and hope is that he is coming to hand out money and contracts. And of course, that was reinforced by the White House press conference here and this very strong message that, hey, look, these guys are here and they're spending billions. But this is critically different from what his domestic constituency back home in Saudi Arabia will be looking for and ultimately judging him on. This is not intended to be a massive shopping trip. Instead, his challenge is to get investment that will bring Saudi Arabia money and, crucially, jobs for Saudi nationals. And this is tricky today because the Saudi pitch, the Saudi approach to foreign and direct investment has changed quite profoundly in recent years. Traditionally, businesses have been attracted to Saudi Arabia because it's a big consumer market and a big government market. It's the biggest market in the Middle East. It has 32 million people and GDP of around $650 billion, around a quarter of the size of the UK economy, and it's the only Arab country to be in the G20. So traditionally, when it's been seeking foreign investment, it has pitched itself on the size of the market, and people have come to it to take advantage of government-led growth and consumer spending that has been underpinned by government-led growth, all of that ultimately underpinned by oil. It is actually the opposite of the Dubai model, where Dubai has a tiny market, a very small population, but has attracted companies through its free zone model to build export-led growth. So in short, companies from the rest of the world have really been interested in selling things to Saudi Arabia rather than producing things there. Looking for government contracts, consumer spending, and sometimes, where there have been chances for public-private partnerships, providing services that are underwritten by the government, power, water, etc. There's also significant productive investment in energy-intensive industries, but much of this has been led by state companies and also has largely often created jobs for expatriates rather than Saudis. Now, looking forward to a time when it will not be able to depend on oil, and already having significantly less oil revenue than it had before late 2014, the Saudi government is trying to prioritise the private sector and production in Saudi Arabia by Saudis. And this is a much more difficult ask because the high incomes that make Saudi Arabia an attractive consumer market also make it an expensive place to produce. So companies need to be confident that producing there will add value. And oil wealth has meant that Saudi Arabia has not had to develop its education system and its research and development as much as many other countries of a similar income level have done to create those high incomes. Although, of course, there are exceptions, and the large number of scholarship students who probably now, the graduates of that programme probably number over 1 million, do represent a significant economic resource and one that companies are keen to tap. But the ask today in terms of the attractiveness of the market is still quite tough, especially at a time when growth is a bit sluggish because government spending is quite constrained. There's also ongoing difficulties in the business environment, and the government's trying to reform that. It's been trying to reform that for a long time. Under the previous king, SAGIA, the Saudi Arabian General Investment Authority, made a lot of efforts to reform the business environment. They were in particular guided by trying to rise up in the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings. Their aim was to be in the top 10 countries in the world, and they got, I think, as far as number 13 before the World Bank slightly shifted its methodology and they plummeted, which can show some of the dangers of benchmarking exercises. In reality, no investors ever thought that Saudi Arabia was the 13th best place in the world to do business, and issues like the court system and the difficulty of actually getting visas to go there and do that business, remained an issue and still remain an issue. The government has continued to introduce business environment reforms, including opening up the number of sectors where 100% foreign ownership is permitted. But it's something that's very hard to do quickly, even with the best will in the world, because it's only partly about legislative decisions. It's also about reforming the incentives and the practices in the bureaucracy, the workforce, the education system. Some people regard it as meaning almost mini cultural revolutions in all of these domains. And that's why there's so much talk inside and outside Saudi Arabia saying, we have this vision now, we know the vision, but we don't quite know the chances of implementation. And talking to Saudi officials or other people who are involved with the economic reforms, everyone's trying to manage expectations and say, don't judge us by exactly the standards of the vision, but if we move towards that direction, this is still good progress. There are certain sectors that have been pitched quite heavily on these visits to the US and UK, which are very promising. And perhaps among the most promising are tourism, sports and entertainment, because these are basically sectors where demand has been artificially suppressed for a long time because of social restrictions. So, for example, with this big entertainment city, Qiddiya, which is planned outside Riyadh, they estimate that last year, Saudi spent $30 billion elsewhere in the region on hospitality and entertainment, as you can imagine, largely in Dubai, not very far away, and in Beirut to some extent. So if they can bring some of that spending home, that's very clear, that's very attractive. And friends who are involved with this kind of thing tell me that recruiting Saudis to do jobs in entertainment, recreation, and the arts is really easy. Frankly, people would do some of those jobs for free because it's fun, it's interesting, you get to meet people. Renewable energy is another sector that's attracting a lot of attention and where there were a lot of useful conversations on the UK visit. But things like NEOM and developing more high-tech industries are areas where really the jury is still out, and investors are looking at some of these things and saying, well, We know that Dubai did a lot of things that people thought were impossible. So maybe these things are possible, but they still look pretty impossible to us. And building that confidence is something that's quite tricky. And this, ultimately does lead us to political risk. Investors anywhere in the world will be looking at political risk, and political risk in Saudi Arabia has become extremely hard to assess today because basically all the old assumptions that Saudi experts like me made about how the royal family functions and how the contract with the clerics function and all of these things clearly no longer apply. But it's difficult for people to assess the new rules of the game and really assess the levels of political risk. One big long-term question is around the changing social contract, because the economic relations between citizen and state are changing. Up to a point, there have been cuts in subsidies. The public sector has essentially frozen hiring for quite a few years now, and citizens are being given the message that you are going to have to work very differently from your parents. But social attitudes still mean people have quite a strong sense of entitlement from the government, and almost universally do prefer to work in the public sector. And so we are seeing that there's a bit of back and forth here, and even as we have VAT coming in, taxation as quite a dramatic change, there are public sector pay increases to help take some of the political heat out of that, even if that actually goes against the goal of incentivising private sector participation. And there's some debate now over, the state of freedom of speech and public consultation in Saudi Arabia, both around the economic changes and around the social changes, where, again, the kind of conventional wisdom of experts about what could and couldn't be done in Saudi society has been somewhat upended. And, there is a view held by some Saudi observers and probably, by many in Saudi Arabia, that to impose these sorts of dramatic changes, austerity, cultural change, etc., it's not conducive to have a lot of public consultation, that having a non-democratic, maybe an autocratic leader helps to push through rapid change, and people refer to the so-called China model or the so-called Dubai model. But usually these so-called models are not models at all. They're specific case studies that need to be examined and understood. They can't simply be replicated. So frankly, it annoys me a bit when people talk about, the China model for the Middle East. There is nowhere in the Middle East that can replicate the Chinese economic miracle. Saudi Arabia cannot lift millions of people out of poverty by leveraging its massive low-cost labour base. It is instead in something of a middle income trap. And similarly, Saudi Arabia isn't Dubai. It's not going to have that kind of demographic model where you'd have to bring in about 100 million foreigners to get to Dubai's kind of population ratio. Also, the kinds of transformation that Saudi Arabia seems to be seeking now seem very much to require very active participation and engagement by Saudi citizens as workers, as entrepreneurs, and as investors. And that means the government does need their buy-in. You may be able to put red lines in place on freedom of speech. You can't impose entrepreneurship. Currently, the local business community is struggling with the rapid changes that are going on. The business models are struggling to adapt to a future where they're expected to be more entrepreneurial, more creative, less dependent on government contracts, and less dependent on cheap foreign labour. And anecdotally, there doesn't seem to be much investment by local companies. Some say, essentially, we are trying to keep our heads down and focus on just maintaining ourselves at a time of immense disruption. Ultimately, local investment is going to be critical, because if local investors aren't investing, foreign companies will be spooked. And foreign companies, even if they don't legally need local partners now in a lot of sectors, they very much still feel the need for local partners to help them navigate the complex landscape of Saudi Arabia, where the ways of doing things are not always clear to outsiders and not always written down. And they'll very much be looking to local investors to get a sense of things like where the anti-corruption policies are heading, and whether they should be afraid that the fallout from the Ritz-Carlton episode is going to keep disrupting the business environment, or whether this was really a one-off big bang. And I think, very frankly, international business, in principle, welcomes anti-corruption efforts. And it's important also to see that whole Ritz-Carlton episode as something that politically helps to lay the ground for the public to accept austerity, because it's easier to say to the public, you now have to pay VAT, you'll be getting less in terms of benefits if you're saying we're also tackling corruption at the top. If you don't do that, people will be very alienated. But I think businesses are keen to see, they're kind of having a wait-and-see attitude to see whether this leads to more institution building to really create more transparency and accountability in the long term, or whether this was a one-off that was part of political power shifts in the country. And, add to that the recent jail sentence handed out to a Saudi journalist who said that there were windows to corruption in the royal court and was then imprisoned. If you want to fight corruption effectively, you do need to send a clear message that whistleblowers will be protected. These issues are discussed among Saudis. Some of them may also make less than entirely comfortable hearing for Saudi officials. But Saudi Arabia is no longer in its comfort zone. It can't be. And one of the things that will come with the international investment and the desire to get more Western companies and high-tech companies to invest in the economy will mean increased scrutiny of the possible political risk there as well. The potential for the Middle East's biggest market to be dramatically changed and to have its private sector open up, to have its talent better educated and better utilised. The prize is really huge, but the uncertainty at the moment is also great. I look forward very much to hearing your comments and taking any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. You covered a lot of ground there. And I really liked a couple of the kind of comments and the conceptualization of, Saudi Arabia is in a middle-income trap. I think that's really true. And the applicability of a Chinese or a Dubai growth model, you're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense. So this leads me to question, if we're going to get real about Vision 2030 and why is the Crown Prince on a world tour? Does it have really anything to do with the necessary economic changes that may or may not take place in the kingdom? How do we put those two things together? What is the objective of this outreach, and what's really necessary domestically? We have a lot of well-informed, bright people around the table with us. So I actually, if you don't mind, Vivian, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm really curious about how Saudis feel about the necessary changes to the way they think about work, the way work happens. So there's a lot of concern, of the job losses that are happening. Saudi Arabia has relied on cheap labor. Saudis are not taking up the jobs that expats held, especially in construction sector, things like that. How do people feel? Jane says people are happy to work for an entertainment company, happy to work in tourism. How do people feel about working in retail? How do people feel about, not getting that public sector job? So, Vivian, introduce yourself and tell us what you're hearing on that subject.
Yeah, sure. My name is Vivian Niraim. I am a Bloomberg reporter based in Riyadh. I don't think I need this. Everybody can hear me, right? Or does
For the computer.
Okay, I do need this.
Yeah.
So I can basically speak based on our reporting, what we have found and what we've been hearing when we talk to people. I'm a little bit skeptical of the idea that sort of Saudis aren't willing to take these tough jobs, which is sort of a commonly held belief. Because I think we do see them, taking jobs that are not necessarily or haven't been necessarily super prestigious, or super fun or super amazing. And it depends on their economic level. So you'll see a lot of Saudi Careem and Uber drivers these days, which isn't necessarily the most glamorous thing. You'll see Saudis working in retail, obviously, especially women, which was a big shift when it happened. And you go into a lot of stores now and you'll see all Saudi women working there, and they generally seem to be pretty psyched to have those jobs, whether from economic necessity or sort of a desire to get out and be active and contribute and get out of the house, I have seen Saudi women working in factories. I have seen Saudi men working in factories. I have seen, most recently, female baristas at Starbucks. Was a kind of shock for me. I walked into a Starbucks, and there were two Saudi women behind the counter, one in a niqab and one with a long hair and a baseball cap. And I was like, if ever there was an advertisement for Vision 2030, that is it. I wish that somebody was here with a camera. So I think that shift is starting to happen. Where you see kind of more friction in our experience and in our reporting is when businesses feel that they can't find somebody with the skills that they need necessarily for a particular job, or somebody who's willing to work the hours that they need to work for a particular job. And I think that's going to be a sticky transition. But I don't think it's impossible. I mean, we have seen that happen to some extent in Bahrain and Oman, where I used to live and report as well. I came after the time when all the taxi drivers were Omani, but I heard that there had been sort of a transition when, suddenly there were no more Indian taxi drivers, and oh my God, what's going to happen? And then, now it's all Omanis, and it's more expensive, but the market somewhat corrected that. I don't know that Saudis are going to work in construction anytime soon. I think that might be the one thing where the wages just don't make sense. But there is sort of a sort of shifting process happening in a lot of those retail jobs. They did sort of Saudiize the mobile phone sales shops recently. And I sort of went out there after one of the complexes had been Saudiized. And it wasn't a smooth process. A lot of shops actually had to shut down for a while because they couldn't find enough Saudi workers who were willing to work for the salaries they were offering. They had to sort of then maybe raise the salaries a little bit, see what they could do. There was a lot of back and forth, but there are a lot of Saudis working in those jobs now. Some of them are going to require extra training. Sometimes businesses feel that that's going to be onerous, and we're going to see, I think, a big shift this year because there was an expatriate fee introduced in January that companies need to pay for sort of every foreign worker that they have, and it's going to go up every year. And that has not been a super smooth introduction. There's been a lot of complaints from businesses that we've seen. All the Saudi chambers of commerce sent these very sharply worded missives to the labor minister, essentially asking for urgent meetings to, this is affecting businesses. Businesses are going to shut down because they just can't afford these fees. They can't find Saudis to replace some of these people, at least this quickly. So that's going to be an interesting transition to watch this year. I did just see the finance minister the other day, and I asked him if they were looking at revising that fee because there's been so much complaint from the private sector. And he said they were not considering revising it, that they sort of had studied what the impact would be, and they, he didn't think it was going to be as bad as people thought it would be. And that might be true. I mean, it might be that the businesses have been spoiled for a while with a really, really cheap labor, and of course they're not going to like transitioning to more expensive labor and having to pay people what would be on a local scale more of a living wage for the Saudis. But it's not that Saudis are spoiled at all by any means, and I get very affronted when I read that. And there's a lot of literature out there that frequently implies that Saudis are spoiled or just are demanding a lot. A lot of the Saudis that I was meeting working in the mobile phone shops and retail, I mean, they're earning 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 riyals a month, sometimes less. They're not taking exorbitant salaries, and they are willing to, and sometimes excited to take those jobs. I mean, I talked to one Saudi worker in the mobile phone shop who was super excited that he was earning, 5,000 riyals a month, which is not a salary that any Western expat would accept. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's really useful. Jane mentioned that you can't impose entrepreneurship. So that's sort of the micro level that Vivian's describing, but what about at the SME level, right? So a small company, medium-sized sort of company has maybe 100 employees, maybe it's in manufacturing, maybe it's in contracting of some kind, maybe in renewable energy. How are these kinds of business decisions to start a new business, to kind of try to enter. I agree with you. There is definitely a wait and see approach. We're seeing very much a flat or declining consumer spending across the kingdom. What would make it different? And how does this public diplomacy or the efforts of the Crown Prince to go out and try to attract investment, how do those two audiences meet, do you think?
Well, I have heard some complaining from some local companies when they see the big pitches to international investors that they start to worry that foreign investors might be treated better. So they look at something like NEOM, which is adopting a Dubai-like free zone model where there would be different regulation, and they say, well, hang on, what about us? And of course, austerity brings out complaints from the business sector as well, because they say things are getting more expensive, there's more fees, more taxes, more cost of labour, all of those things. But I think it does also relate to some social factors around fear of failure and fear of taking risks, which can also relate to family attitudes, things like this, where there still needs to be quite a lot of cultural change. And I think the government has shown some leadership for some years now in trying to suggest that Saudis don't just need to have prestigious jobs. You think back to, there was a great photo once of the former Labour Minister Ghazi Al-Ghoseibi flipping burgers, I think also wearing a baseball cap. But ultimately, wages and income are still important. And I think for the kind of Saudis that you're talking about, it's really interesting to hear those examples. If they're earning those kinds of salaries, though, in most parts of the country, it would be difficult for them to get married and raise a family. So it's great if you are living at home and you're getting that extra income and you've got that newfound independence. But the salaries in the private sector, they have been fundamentally shaped by the fact that most of the work is done by so-called bachelors, by people who have to leave their families back at home in a low-income country and are remitting the money there. So I think for people starting a family, there probably needs to be more thought. Also with the Labour Ministry is doing a lot of work now to have more policies for women to enter the workforce. And I think, again, more thought could be put into family-friendly working, flexible working, things where there is a lot of international best practice that could be learned from. Because for women, one of the reasons the public sector is attractive, and 1/3 of public sector jobs, I think, have been held by women for quite a long time now, is because the hours mean, you can still spend that time with your family. And local private sector companies especially are not anything like so flexible.
Good point. Would anyone else kind of like to ask a question or comment on this mismatch between, skills and market jobs available, or also the mismatch, we could say, between the courting of foreign investors and the possibility for what kind of businesses might actually animate the private sector in Saudi Arabia? Any thoughts on that?
Just one, I'm reminded, Karen, in a conversation we had in this room some time ago, someone mentioned the fact that Saudis are going to have to get used to having a Saudi plumber or a Saudi electrician come into their house now with standards that may not be up to what they've expected. And so how much of a backlash might that cause as they say, I'm just not getting the services I expect to get from my own country people?
That's interesting, especially for me coming from Britain, where we're going to face that with Brexit as well. You never have a British plumber, but there was a kind of scandal a few years ago where Saudi newspapers highlighted Saudi women working as cleaners, and the general public response, as evinced through the media and social media, was, "This is appalling. How could anybody let this happen?" And there's probably not quite the same stigma around manual labour for men, but yeah, I think it's still an issue.
Gerald? And give your name too, please.
Jerry Firestein. I'm with the Middle East Institute now. And I wonder how much thought is being given. I mean, you look at Vision 2030 and they highlight specific sectors like entertainment, tourism, which are basically labor-intensive, low-cost industries. One of the things that struck me when Steve and I were in Yemen is that the economic structure in Saudi Arabia seemed to be completely out of whack in terms of Saudi Arabia being a middle-class society, as you described. For example, one of the things that always struck me is that Saudi Arabia exports leather jackets to Yemen. They export fruits and vegetables to Yemen. And you sit there and think, well, why would Saudi Arabia be producing labor-intensive, low-profit, low-margin items like a leather jacket instead of having Yemen produce them and exporting them to Saudi Arabia? And so my question is there any thought being given to how the private sector develops to try to target those industries that, in fact, do produce more income and are more sustainable going forward? And I think you're absolutely right in terms of the long-term social impact of these kinds of economic changes.
I think a lot of studies have been done. I think there's been a lot of planning. Before Vision 2030, most of this was done in quite a decentralised way. So a particular ministry would come up with a plan, the minister would change, he'd come up with another plan, they wouldn't share it with other ministries. So there's been a lot of stuff that hasn't really taken wing. SAGIA probably did the most to try to centralise some of these things. And, Vision 2030 in some ways isn't that new. And sometimes you hear Saudis getting frustrated that they feel international consultants are getting a lot of credit for work that was done before and was quite familiar to them. And when it comes to agriculture, for instance, there has been for some years an effort to move away from the incredibly costly system of producing things like wheat, which are water intensive and basically don't make sense, although Saudis still like locally produced milk. There just seems to be a market preference for that. I think one issue is that agricultural production is often in lower income regions as well, where they do have also climate that's more conducive to agriculture. There are really significant regional income disparities, where if you're in Aba or Jizan or something, you are earning way less than half what somebody would be earning in Riyadh. So the kind of competitiveness, the cost competitiveness of labour is different there, although obviously still not comparable to Yemen.
We've got a few hands up, and I do want, Afshin, I see you there, and I'm going to call on you because I know you're going to have a lot to say too. Please, go first. And introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Brian Katoulis with the Center for American Progress.
Nice
It's
to
nice
meet
to meet you. Yeah, I learned a lot from your work. You mentioned the political risk and trying to even assess that. I'm wondering what you see from the global debt markets, because Saudi Arabia has gone over the last couple of years with the mega bond and other things, which is an interesting move on their part. And I know they've got a lot of cash reserves. But do you see any reaction, especially since the events in November? You mentioned the hesitancy of local investors, and then there's been reports like in yesterday's Financial Times about foreign investors sort of sitting on the sidelines and trying to see what happens. Do you see any shifts sort of in that, and because of the political risk? And then related, do you have any sense of where Saudi Arabia might be going on currency policy, if at all, if there's any shifts that we might anticipate there?
I haven't really been tracking the risk premiums on debts, although Vivian might have some insights there. But I think that lending to Saudi Arabia is a much easier ask than the kind of investment that they particularly need, which is to create jobs and put the long-term direct investment in. So I think there's a kind of a mismatch there as well, that for most people that are looking at lending to Saudi Arabia over 5 years or so, they think, well, unless the royal family completely disappeared, which no one thinks is very likely, we're probably going to get paid back out of oil money. Maybe there's a chance of non-payment that gets factored in, or slow payment. But it's still a very different level of risk appetite from what people need to make job-creating investments. And here there's a sort of catch-22, I think, because if people ultimately aren't investing and aren't creating jobs, that will by itself help to increase the political risk What was your second question?
Just on the currency.
On the peg.
I don't know. I've been covering the Saudi economy since 2003, and my answer to this has basically always been it won't change. And so far, that's been right. As I say, all these old assumptions may not be true. You know, it would increase the competitiveness of non-oil exports, but I don't
But
really.
there aren't any.
Yeah. So it could be good, you know, but it could be good for exporting goods and services. But then a lot of your exports of services are also to the neighbouring countries. I don't really see a strong argument for doing it.
Could I answer on the debt a little bit?
Great.
So Saudi Arabia issued almost $40 billion of debt in the last couple of years, and it was kind of a lucky just factor of global debt markets. Why that was possible is because people who were interested in buying sovereign bonds weren't earning much anywhere else in the world. So it was just kind of an opportunity. They want to go to market again and issue as much as $30 billion again this year. And things will be different because Fed rates have gone up, right? It's going to be more expensive. And what I think is important to look at is the repayment of these, and they're 5, 10, 15, and 30-year bonds. So if you look down the road at, 2045, when this repayment starts coming due, if things haven't really changed, if oil prices stay where they are or go lower, if the government continues to spend at the rate it spends and draws down on its reserve assets, that is going to take a big chunk out of the fiscal budget. And Bahrain will face this very, very soon, right? Oman will face this as much as 30% of Bahrain's budget will be in debt repayment very, very soon. So Saudi Arabia, at the current trajectory, could have a debt problem in 10, 15 years very easily, which also becomes then a currency problem.
Thank you.
All right, yes, please, sir.
I'm Patrick Theros. I used to be ambassador to Qatar and I've been involved in a lot of Gulf issues. Slightly off the topic, but when you talk to people who talk about political risk in Saudi Arabia, the truth is, though, the kingdom over the last couple of years has engaged in a number of foreign policy initiatives that picking a fight with Iran, the war in Yemen, picking a fight with Qatar, and so forth. Which could affect internal stability. How much is this a conversation among the people trying to assess political risk?
I think these issues figure very high up there because ultimately they are affecting how people assess the style of decision making. And internationally, while elements of those policies might be popular at home, internationally, both the war in Yemen and the standoff with Qatar for different reasons are not judged to be foreign policy successes, I think it's safe to say. And I think there's also a sense that the kingdom hasn't really changed its strategy on either front, despite the absence of any obvious success. So I think those are definitely questions that people ask about. Yemen's obviously a significantly bigger concern, not least because the war has evolved into a situation where there are more serious threats now to Saudi Arabia itself, with the Houthis having obtained the capacity now to fire missiles into Saudi territory, even if they haven't hit targets. The chances for Qatar to kind of rebound on Saudi Arabia are much less, but I think it has added to a general perception of that political risk has increased.
The gentleman in the lavender, yes.
Hi, my name is Nathan, not from any particular institution or organization. My question is how is the Wahhabist community, or Wahhabi community, going to be reacting to a lot of these social economic changes? I've been kind of looking at the news to see if I see any type of reactions, any protests. What kind of reactions are we seeing? Because everything I've seen is there's no reaction. And one of the things I had the opportunity to reread recently was the 1979 siege of Mecca. One of the reasons why that came about is because of the progression at the time. Not saying that could potentially happen again, but are we seeing any type of negative repercussions from the more conservative community in Saudi Arabia?
So I'd love to hear Jane answer that, and maybe Kristen Duan, would you maybe
Great.
weigh in after Jane?
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating because I think, prior to MBS, the degree to which Saudi society was conservative was exaggerated. And now, the degree to which it is open and socially liberal is also being exaggerated. And the society is very heterogeneous, but we know that there are many very conservative people, perhaps especially in some of the rural areas, and there are many people who have been, brought up and educated to believe in one way of doing things, who are now being told that that's completely wrong and are struggling to process that or are not convinced. Now, you're not actually hearing organised opposition coming from political Islamist leaders, which is something that, has happened in the past in Saudi Arabia. Currently, those voices are pretty much silenced, and I say silenced rather than silent because, there have been arrests of particularly prominent clerics such as Sheikh Salman al-Auda in September last year, who was one of the best-known clerics of the Sahwa, the Islamic awakening of the 1990s. And he, for quite some time, had been largely getting on with the government, semi-co-opted, if you will, at the time of Mohammed bin Nayef at the Interior Ministry, who thought some of these sort of semi-Islamist guys could be useful allies against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. To see that flip and to see him go back to jail where he had been in the past sent a very strong message to every less powerful, less popular, less influential Islamist that it's not a very good time to speak out. But I worry that this creates an artificial sense of consensus that may lead the government into some complacency at a time when you have a very powerful leader where it's not very easy to tell him no or tell him you're wrong. And I've spoken to people who know him or who have advised him, who have said, we thought he was going too fast with the social reforms, and he said it's fine, and he was right because we don't hear any resistance. But that doesn't mean that the resistance isn't there. One Saudi friend of mine argues that one of the ways that pushback is coming is through more pressure on individual women, so that people may not overtly push back against Mohammed bin Salman for changing the role of women, but they might be more likely to hassle women that are seen to have crossed social lines or worn the wrong thing or so forth. That happens on social media. It's something that can happen within the family. It's not as obvious as organised opposition, but it is a symptom of there being this contestation and this uncertainty among parts of the society about whether this is the right way forward. All that said, equally, if you continued the previous status quo, you also leave large parts of the society feeling frustrated that things are too conservative. So there isn't an easy answer, but it might have flipped too far in one direction as a reaction against the past.
Kristen?
I agree with everything that Jane said. Just to add a little more detail, I think we probably underestimate the degree to which a lot of this work was starting to be done even under King Abdullah. I mean, I think there was a determination already that the Islamic movements and these trends were not going to be positive for the government given the international situation in the sense that they could at some time pose a threat to the government. So there were a lot of policies that were undertaken even under King Abdullah to restrict these movements, cut back on some of the programs that they had, after-school programs, like, they used to have much more free reign in terms of running summer programs and things like that. After school, those were being restricted. A lot of the institutions that they were functioning also being restricted. And then, of course, in 2014, the Muslim Brotherhood was declared a terrorist organization. And at key points, there were also key arrests that were made. So every time they were taking a position against these movements, I mean, kind of in favor of more social openness or something like that, you would see key arrests being made. So I think the message was being sent for some time that this was not going to be tolerated, any sort of dissent. And then I agree with Jane that the arrests that took place in September were really broad, actually, and hit really key figures within the Islamic movements, key, very figures that were seen as what's the right word, credible really credible. People had strong followings and that were key leaders. And the Saudi Islamic landscape is really complex, I think. So it's not just one group, but they kind of caught key people in all of these different groups, from sort of hardliners, from different movements, both kind of Muslim Brotherhood networks and sorority networks, all the way down to, like Jane mentioned, some of the more reformists as well. So I think just the message was really being sent, that there's no, that there's not any sort of dissent won't be tolerated. But I agree with Jane, we'll have to kind of see how that plays out. I also suspect that the population was shifting a bit, so that these movements, both by the discipline from the government and from just cultural shift that we're seeing across the Gulf, they were weakening a bit. We could see that through the rise of a lot of youth movements, that some of them even coming from these Islamic movements and wanting to see a new direction. So I think that's also played into it.
Kristen, hold the mic for a second, because I want to push you on a conversation that we've had recently on how women are very much kind of in the trenches of these reforms, right? Both on the economic and the social issues. And women are so important in terms of, if we can increase women's employment, that will be a boost to consumer spending and would be kind of, would actually almost even out with the impact of the subsidy reduction, in that, those cutbacks in the economy. But women will be in the trenches or on the front lines, whatever metaphor you want to use, and also, in the family, of confronting the ability to do something different, whether it's in the workplace or whether how they dress or what they participate in their leisure time. That's an individual choice, but it's going to have, wide-ranging, community impact and social consequence. So what does that mean? What does that mean for women? I mean, in your view, and Jane as well. Anyone else who wants to weigh in on that one?
I think Jane mentioned that we're probably going to see a lot of resistance, not so much on the institutional level or movement level, because the politics are going to become very difficult for these movements, but in terms of, the pressure that's put on individual women to not be able to partake in these new kind of public spheres that are opening up to them. And I think one thing that will be interesting to watch, too, is the real variation of reception across the Gulf and in certain regions. And I think, Vivian, in fact, you've written about this, right? So you can see in different areas of the kingdom probably different sorts of reception, different kind of communities. And I think as well, a lot of the economic reforms will also be received very differently. Some communities will be able to manage that quite well. Others will really be hit hard by the increased fees, by loss of government jobs. I talked to the Minister of Education. He said they're even going to be looking at starting to think about charging tuition, at least for graduate school at some point. So these are all very new things for Saudis. And I imagine we're going to probably see different kinds of forms of resistance at some point, probably in a more medium term, emerging in the kingdom.
I'd like to add that for some years now, women have made up the majority of university graduates and have been getting the best degrees, which has been true in many countries. And if you had an entirely level playing field in the workplace, then that would imply that women would be getting the best jobs. And there will naturally be resistance and pushback from men, which might manifest itself as religious conservatism, but also has a simple kind of economic driver. That's a big adjustment. If you see women getting promoted above you, possibly earning more than you, all of these things that we might imagine. So I think there will be quite a lot of social contestation over that changing role for women, and quite a lot to think about in terms of how men react to their relative position often becoming worse.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on the women issue, or let's change to a new topic? Afshin, you want to weigh in?
Thank you, Karen. Maybe I'll just weigh in anecdotally on the women's issue, and then raise another topic. I first went to Saudi Arabia. Now it's around 25 years, straight out of college, thanks to the gentleman sitting on my left, Dr. John Duke Anthony, who sent me to Saudi Arabia to work for an English language newspaper called the Arab News. And back then, in Riyadh, women were not even allowed in the building. In Jeddah, we had women who worked in the Arab News, but they were in a separate room. And then gradually over the years, as I went back and visited, and I would see, then in Jeddah, women would work, but they would work in the newsroom, but there was a glass partition separating them. Gradually, I would see that change. The glass would come down. They began to work in the newsroom. And we've moved forward to today where you have women editors-in-chief. A few years ago, I was in Riyadh at a conference, and a woman approached me to ask me to be on one of her shows. And I thought, that's great. We've got associate producers as women on Saudi television. She turned out to be the executive producer of that show, ordering the men around. So for those of us who've kind of seen this for 20-plus years, it is really transformational. And I'm glad that Kristen brought up King Abdullah, because in all of the excitement, some of it justifiable about the reforms that Mohammed bin Salman is bringing to Saudi Arabia, and King Salman is bringing, let's not forget King Salman, to Saudi Arabia. I think we shouldn't forget what King Abdullah had done, particularly on some of the dialogue initiatives and some of the things that he did in terms of shifting the outlook of the Muslim World League, shifting the outlook of the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, and at least trying to shift their outlooks and pushing back against the Wahhabist clerical establishment. And since Jane, you rightly noted that I think conservatism was over-exaggerated, and I think Vivian noted that the fact that Saudis don't work is over-exaggerated. I think, maybe since we're piercing these over-exaggerated myths, maybe one also to pierce is this idea that there's always this idea that plays out whenever you read books about Saudi Arabia or summaries about Saudi Arabia, that there's this Wahhabist clerical Al Saud alliance, right? Alliance suggests that these are equal forces. The Wahhabist clerical establishment is not an equal force to the Al Saud ruling family, and they haven't been an equal force really from the beginning. And so what we're seeing is in terms of the pushback against the Wahhabist clerical establishment may seem like they are being degraded, but the Wahhabist clerical establishment always fell in line. They didn't have an independent source of income. They would always essentially fall in line. And so those are just my comments. But on my question, is do you think? Why not pursue a China model / Japan model / South Korea model, state-guided capitalism, right? You have a strong man there. You impose export discipline on companies, a la General Park in South Korea. You don't follow the prescriptions of the World Bank and IMF, and you anoint some national champions, but you make sure they have export discipline. Why not follow that kind of Asia state-guided capitalist model?
What would they make, Afshin?
Well, that's if they want to make things, that's the way to do it,
Yeah.
right? And in fact, by the way, I think it's worth noting in a session with Khalid Al-Fala and Mohammed Al-Sheikh just a couple of days ago, they did talk about the fact that they are the largest country that buys cars that does not have an automotive manufacturing, and which I took to imply that they might want to move into that space. Defense industry as well is a space that they seem to want to move into in terms of manufacturing as well. So, please go ahead.
Thank you. That's very useful. I'll pick up on state capitalism and then I think touch on the clerics falling into line. They've had some elements of state capitalism, with Saudi Aramco and Sabic and Ma'aden, and the most success they've had in creating new cities have been the royal commissions at Jubail and Yanbu, which have been much kind of more straightforward to carry out than the various economic cities that were supposed to be created by the private sector and didn't really materialize. And you've seen, a world-class petrochemicals and plastics industry built up that's successfully selling to China and other places. But the business model has generally been exploiting natural resources and utilising imported labour. And for at least some of the sectors that are being targeted, I guess they're looking for international expertise and know-how. And it's a lot of it is about the technology transfer and the capacity of government to lead growth beyond these sectors that they already know quite well. But I think, in some ways, in certain sectors with certain companies, they've had real success with a kind of state-led model. On cars and defence, it's interesting. I mean, they have been trying to promote things like manufacturing tyres as a way to get towards automotive manufacturing. And, you know, in other parts of the Middle East, you've had some success in Morocco, for example, with building up that sector, obviously in a much more low-wage country. But I think companies are still sceptical about the labour force. And if they can't employ so many foreigners, can they rely on a steady supply of Saudis who will do boring factory jobs and stay there for a long time after you've done the initial training? So I think that's one of the issues there. Defence is very interesting because Vision 2030 targets 50% of spending on arms to be spent at home by 2030. That's obviously an aspiration, rather than something that should be taken literally. But we've already seen some success by Saudi Arabia in getting big defence companies to do some local assembly and invest in local training. And I think there'll be more and more of those conditions put on these big ticket defence purchases that actually you have to be producing more in Saudi Arabia. That, of course, will be at odds with, you know, a US leadership that wants to advertise, we are creating 40,000 American jobs through doing this. There's different interests from the two sides. And on the clerics, you're absolutely right. The clerics have always fallen into line, whether it was the presence of American troops on Saudi soil or women driving. They are, you know, to some extent, government employees. But that has also eroded their credibility. And I think it's a difficult situation for any government when they try to influence religious debate. How much can politicians get involved in that? How much do people who are not clerics or theologians have the credibility to lead on that? And we've seen Mohammed bin Salman talking about kind of moderate Islam and having this new sort of fatwa centre to say what's appropriate, but there is not very much kind of tolerated space for clerics and religious leaders to really work out what is the future of Saudi Salafism? What does it look like when suddenly things that were the norm yesterday are being described as extremist? How can we approach these things? And I think that has to be done away from the direct interests of political leaders. I see even parallels in Europe, when there's sometimes pressure on politicians to kind of reform Islam in their societies, which is even worse because, you know, you're talking about minority groups and minority rights and so forth. But I think there can be a credibility problem to state-led efforts. And young Saudis don't have to just look at Saudi clerics, obviously. They can just go online and pick up fatwas and advice from clerics based anywhere. It's not something the government can control.
So we've got kind of two streams here. We have the social religious and we have the state-led capitalism, and we can choose our own adventure, which direction we want to go. Since I'm the moderator, let me choose one first, and then I know, Mr. Anthony, we'll have you go next, and Mr. Ottaway after that. Afshin, on your point of, you know, what would be an export market, you know, a lot of what the Gulf states do export to the United States and should come up this week in the visits. You know, aluminum is an important one from the Middle East, and the UAE is the #1 Middle East exporter to the U.S., Bahrain second, and Saudi Arabia third. This doesn't go along with the Trump administration's current view, right? So, you know, are these visions of opportunities maybe at odds? That's just a comment. Mr. Anthony, which direction would you like to go in?
Pick up on a point that Afshin made about don't overestimate Saudi Arabians' aversion to work of any kind, manual and otherwise. These points, I think, might enrich the conversation or at least open the window. Let's not underestimate the power of the ongoingness of fixed social norms, okay? For women to work, even for young men to work in manual technical positions is new. It's new to our generation. It doesn't have 50 years legs on it yet. So don't underestimate the pull of the continuity of comfort or the seduction thereof. Secondly, there's still an ongoingness of social stigma. You have to work, to the woman. Your wife has to work. What's wrong? What's gone wrong? You have a degree. You have 2 degrees. You have 3 degrees. This has never happened before in your family, or for the most part in that tribe. What's going on? So you're put on the defensive more than would ordinarily be the norm in other places. 3 is the family aspect. The years I've lived there off and on, yes, I've known a lot of people who didn't have jobs, who'd come back, who had the tools, the education. But the family said, wait a minute, something's going to turn up in the government. Your uncle told me that 3 people are going to retire by the end of May. Just hang in there. I know it's November. Just hang in there. And something's going to open up for you. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't shame the family. That's the implication there. Fourthly, there has to do with the role of the newspapers. I don't know how closely any of you follow them, but if you look at page 2 of most of the newspapers, whether it's Al Riyadh or Sharq al-Awsat, etc., this is where the government on its side has been trying to showcase people who go against this grain. You have interviews for a young man, 19, who sweeps the streets, and you have an interview with him. Well, I'm the only one amongst my pals that does this, and the rest of them sit home all day long and they mope and they complain and they gripe, etc. And that, by the way, their chances for marriage are not so hot either. As a result, who's going to marry that daughter to somebody who's not employed? What bank is going to loan money to somebody who's not employed to find access to affordable housing there? And these individuals say, at least I'm out, I'm exercising, I'm getting a workout, I'm outdoors, I'm not indoors, etc. They've had limited effect, and it would be difficult to even quantify them. But notionally, you can see where the government is trying to do that. That's not true in most Western societies, but it's needed there, okay? Lastly, with regard to 2 concepts that have stuck by me now for about half a century, when I lived in Aden, when it was Marxist-Leninists and the only American allowed to live there. Not that I was on the right. But there were 2 terms that stuck in my mind that said, look, material phenomena here. Whoever has the financial wherewithal, who amongst such individuals will excitedly, willingly engage in the socially repugnant work for their life? Who amongst those who can pay someone else to do it will engage in the physically arduous work of the world? Because of the image and because you don't have to. There, objectively, yes, Saudi Arabians, Yemenis, Omanis, Bahrainis have to. The unemployment figures are out there. But don't underestimate the pull of these traditional social norms, social stigma, social pressures.
Thank you. Mr. Ottaway?
I wanted to go back to the Dave Ottaway from the Wilson Center. I wanted to go back to this issue of how you create jobs in an economy. And like the World Bank and IMF, they're all pushing SMEs. So on my last 2 trips to Saudi Arabia, I started talking to both government institutions that are trying to promote it and people that are entering the SME economies. And I discovered, or I think we kind of know this, but talking to people, if you're really starting a small SME, having to employ a Saudi rather than a foreigner raises your labor cost to such an extent that you can't make it. And so, and then talking to a medium-sized businessman down in Jeddah, he could afford it, but he was only, and this was with agreement with the Saudis, he employed Saudis, but they didn't come to work. And both sides were happy because the level of, going back to the work habits, et cetera, the Saudis were just as either to have another job or stay at home and be paid, but not working in the company. Then on the third example I ran into was a woman on e-commerce. And she seemed to be the happiest because she didn't have to employ anybody else. She was a sole owner and running the company. So my question is on this SME, it's almost like a mania now, that this is the solution to the jobs problem. Do you think the SMEs have is this the way they can go to solve the jobs problem? And if it's not SMEs, where are they going to employ all these, hundreds of thousands of Saudis, well-educated, that are coming onto the market?
Well, I think job creation is the major problem that they face, and that they're trying to do it at all levels, sometimes with the big state-backed projects, entertainment, NEOM, all of these things have shipbuilding, all these things have really big targets for job creation. Now, the SMEs argument that the World Bank makes, that's widely made because when you look at most economies, most people are working for SMEs. But the whole business environment in Saudi Arabia hasn't been set up that way. It's been set up for big state-owned companies and also for big merchant families. And I think when you talk to the people that are running SMEs all across the Gulf, they all have complaints about the government not setting up the environment for them. They also have complaints about the big businesses competing with them and not supporting them. Sometimes countries can put policies in place that require big state companies to source from SMEs or to source from local SMEs. Those things are interesting, but they may also conflict with the desires to be doing more international economic cooperation. When they come to the UK or US, people are asking sort of how can our SMEs get involved with Saudi Aramco or SABIC or all these things. So, yeah, I think if you look right across the Middle East, every government has been talking for decades about how brilliant SMEs are and how they have to help young entrepreneurs, and the success rate so far has been pretty dismal.
Interesting that the UAE government has actually now backtracked on its recommendation to banks and their lending policy towards SMEs. They're like basically admitting that it didn't work very well. So, and they're not repaying as consistently as they should be.
Yeah.
So this is absolutely a problem. We do have some expertise at the table from the international financial institutions. If anyone would like to weigh in on that topic, you're more than welcome. I won't point you out. Yeah, Mimi, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Mimi Burke from Brownstein Hyatt. And thank you, Jane, for coming today and talking to us about such an important subject. But since we are talking about the Saudi economy, I wanted to ask you about the 500-pound elephant in the room, the Saudi Aramco IPO. Last week we heard that the initial offering is going to be locally in Saudi Arabia, which is something unprecedented. And I'd like to know your view on that, your insight, and also going forward, the larger initial public offering and how that is really the cornerstone of Vision 2030 and how that will translate.
Thank you. As obviously there's been a big debate about where it would be listed, and it came as a surprise to many to hear it's not going to be New York, Frankfurt, London, etc. I think there were various problems with listing in any of these jurisdictions. Here, of course, questions about JASTA. In London, questions about transparency and suggestions that it would not meet the kind of conditions that are needed for a London Stock Exchange premium listing, which would enable it to get into indices and so forth. So there's been a lot of kind of problems around various options for international listing. Locally, there's been a trend for some years to try to boost the stock market and try to kind of gradually get more foreign investment into it. But then you still have questions from international investors about the transparency, about how much disclosure there is. And I think there's some skepticism among investors as well about the merits of buying into such a small stake when you have another shareholder who has 95% of the company. There seems to be a market consensus that the suggestion that the firm would be valued at $2 trillion was a massive overestimate. People vary in their estimations of what it would actually be. But it's hard to see it making the kind of money that it was initially kind of trailed as being. And it's been associated with Vision 2030 because it's one of the big taboo-busting announcements from Mohammed bin Salman. But I don't think it was part of the Vision 2030 plan. I think it was one of many other additional projects that have been added to that vast to-do list. But it fits into trying to boost the sovereign wealth fund. And maybe it will increase its capital by $50 billion or something like that. That's not actually that huge in an economy of about $600 billion a year GDP. I don't really see it being an economically transformational thing, but it does help to create an image of change.
On this side, we have 2 questions. You can fight who goes first.
I wondered if we could talk a bit about, I'm Sigal Samuel, I'm an editor at The Atlantic. I wondered if we could talk about the Silicon Valley visit and if I remember correctly, MBS told Bloomberg that, he looked at what Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and a company had achieved and thought, like, what can I create?
Yes.
And this is perhaps somewhat speculative, but I'm curious for your impressions on to what extent MBS sees himself as a sort of disruptor,
Yes.
More in line maybe with, cut from the same cloth as a Silicon Valley entrepreneur.
Yes, well, this is so interesting. So I've been interviewing Saudi contacts about MBS's personality for a piece I wrote for Prospect magazine in the UK, which was just published. And I was asking people, what leaders does he admire? And the answers I got were his grandfather, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, and Putin, Xi Jinping, and Lee Kuan Yew. Not all obviously going together. So it's quite fascinating. True. That's Silicon Valley's problem as well, isn't it?
It sure is, yep.
So yeah, I think he does share that idea of kind of disruption being something that is not a negative thing, which is where he contrasts with King Abdullah, who clearly had some of the same instincts about where Saudi society would be going, but would see the idea of disruption as something to be avoided at all costs. And clearly he's really fascinated by those kinds of ways of thinking about how you make change and make transformation. I think this outreach to Silicon Valley makes a lot of sense, and that Saudi Arabia has to be thinking about, how do you get to this kind of incredibly agile and innovative thinking, because the rest of the world is changing so fast that you're trying to create jobs for your youth, but you've got no idea what the jobs in the world are going to be in 5 or 10 years' time. It's fascinating to see that they're trying to engage with automation and artificial intelligence and the kind of impacts that those might have on Saudi competitiveness. And I think there are also some people in the tech sector who are very interested in social impact, and when they see Saudi Arabia society changing, the possibility of being part of that is something that is attractive beyond the purely economic. But I think there's also a lot of doubt and uncertainty there as well about how real is this and how worthwhile is it to really put our cash in there.
Please.
Nate Mason with CNO Resources. I think this question is related to the last several questions, but when you speak about Vision 2030, and indeed when anyone talks about Vision 2030, I hear 2 what appear to be mutually exclusive visions, right? One is this: we want to create entrepreneurs, we want to create economic growth in other sectors and so forth. And then the other one is we're going to keep building cities from scratch, this very state-led stuff that crowds out investment into other things, and then we're going to throw everybody in the Ritz-Carlton. And so, an entrepreneur, what do they want? They want stability. They want to be able to see what the rules of the game are. And so so there's a vision of state-led growth, which would be the Lee Kuan Yew, right? And then there's the vision of entrepreneurship, and that's the Silicon Valley. And so in economic affairs and in this sort of who do I want to be like, you hear these mutually exclusive visions, and I'm wondering how you see that square, or that circle gets squared. And then one brief comment about this building cars and defense and stuff. I mean, this has been tried a lot of places, and in Morocco and so forth, they start with, we do wire bundles for Boeing, and and over the course of decades, you get to a real car plant. Defense, you're going right into the top, and you get these incredibly expensive, and this has happened over and over and over again, incredibly expensive, we'll put the armored personnel carrier together here, which doesn't really add anything to our economy, but makes it way more expensive. But you're not actually going to put you're not making the missile part. I mean, this is, I think focusing on defense it's never worked before. It seems easy. I would argue that's a bad idea. That's just a comment, though.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think there are instincts that are pulling in very opposing directions, and there are various attempts to have kind of state-led economic development where the bulk of the legwork would be done by the private sector, and that doesn't always work. So the idea that I mentioned before that Sagia had pushed for 10 or 15 years was to have 6 new economic cities in different areas of Saudi Arabia, partly in order to address the regional economic disparities and create economic centres in the different regions and take population pressure off the major cities, and basically fulfill a set of governmental social objectives. But the idea was that the private sector would fund those things, and it basically didn't work because the incentives weren't there for the private sector, and private sector companies also complained that the infrastructure wasn't properly put in place, and they wanted to see the government put down money and investment first. And the only one that really worked was the one Taylor economic city, the only one anywhere, which was already close to Jeddah and in a fairly wealthy traditional trade area. So, yeah, I think it is problematic. But in a way, because the job creation challenge is so big, I think they're trying to do a bit of everything.
We might be able to wrap up by about 11:30. We have Deb Jones and gentleman here. You had a question. Then we'll go to Ambassador Jones. Where's the microphone? I think we've lost it. Well, you get it first then.
Sorry. Is it on? Yeah, sorry. Deborah Jones, retired Foreign Service. 2 questions. Well, one on Nate's point, I just wanted to say, I'm wondering if the Saudis are thinking of these paired defense projects like the UAE has said, where China comes in and actually does part and part with them. That's the kind of the model that I have been hearing about. But secondly, though, apparently yesterday at Brookings, the foreign minister talked still about a GCC, or kind of a Gulf common market, and did not exclude Qatar from it. In fact, didn't bring up the Qatar issue and did not exclude Qatar from that at all. So I'm wondering what you think their thinking will be on that. I mean, we've never seen even the currency thing. We've seen this go all over the place over the past decades. And then just the other small thing is that I see that, Kuwait is really going to be refocusing again to kind of serve as a bridge. Its dream has always been the goal to serve as a bridge to commerce in Iraq, that will be its kind of cash cow, and that's where its value added is. Do the Saudis ever think in those terms at all too? Or they, apart from Jeddah, they just don't seem, in my limited experience, to be have that same kind of mercantile mentality that we see elsewhere in the Gulf.
Very interesting about the GCC. Obviously, the Qatar dispute has come partly out of frustration that the GCC wasn't aligned on foreign policy, and that in a way they were blowing the myth of GCC unity out of the water. But on economic cooperation, the GCC has had quite a few achievements, and I think it's a strange situation to have an embargo in the middle of a supposed common market. It's unclear where it's going to lead. It creates problems for countries such as Britain, which would like to have a free trade agreement with the GCC after Brexit. And the GCC countries, in theory, can't negotiate bilateral free trade agreements, but how do you negotiate a free trade agreement with a GCC that isn't trading with itself? So I think there are quite a few people simply in the business community in all the countries concerned who would like to find a way to wind this down, but that the political leaders on either side don't feel any compulsion to compromise and all want to save face. Perhaps eventually economic cooperation might be the way to unwind this. I have kind of romantic ideas of the World Cup being a way that you could get together some joint tourism projects, joint cooperation projects of different kinds. But the political mood just doesn't seem to be there. And it does, again and again, seem to be the case that political differences trump opportunities for economic cooperation in the region. And we might be looking at a GCC that becomes a bit like the Arab Maghreb Union, that nominally exists, but basically doesn't do anything because of a big division within it. I think there have been ideas coming out of government ministries at different times about where Saudi Arabia could trade with Iraq and so forth. What could it export to Iraq? But I think with Iraq in particular, the negative political view of it has tended to dominate. It's been interesting. One of the changes Mohammed bin Salman has brought in foreign policy has been this new type of outreach to Iraq that's been a non-sectarian type of outreach to Iraq, and has also included trying to encourage the Saudi private sector to invest there. But certainly my colleague who attended that Kuwait conference came away with the impression that most of the Saudi firms were looking at Iraq with huge uncertainty and saying, well, we don't even know what the election result is going to be. And then you have all the problems with corruption and legislation and so forth. So again, the government wants the private sector to be helping improve relations with Iraq, and the private sector doesn't have that appetite.
I think we have two last questions. The gentleman here has been very patient.
Thank you. I'm Hisham Fahmy with the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt. We sort of circled around Qatar, Yemen, Iraq, now Kuwait, and you haven't mentioned about Egypt and Saudi Arabia and that relationship, and how does that affect the region politically and economically? Could you comment on that?
Good question.
So I think Saudi Arabia and Egypt historically have often had a lot of rivalry, and as you know, and right now I think Egypt's stability is important for Saudi Arabia, and obviously under the previous king, Saudi Arabia started giving a lot of aid to Egypt after the Sisi took power from the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013. At the same time, one doesn't get a sense that there's a lot of love lost between the leaders at present. I think there is a necessity of cooperation. These are Arab linchpins. They have a lot of common interests in foreign policy. Saudi Arabia's got the money, Egypt's got the army, but they clearly don't see eye to eye on everything. You look at the Yemen war, where Egypt helped out, basically to help out Saudi Arabia, but didn't really want to get stuck back into a place that some have called its Vietnam from the past, when of course it used to be fighting the proxy war with Saudi Arabia. You've had the flare-ups around the Red Sea Islands and so forth. A lot of uncertainty about what NEOM really means for Egypt and Jordan, and who's really calling the shots there. I think the relationship between the UAE and Egypt is much more close, because I think they see eye to eye more. And finally, I thought it was very interesting to see Sisi being one of the various international leaders who was trying to calm things down around Lebanon when Hariri made his interesting resignation from Saudi Arabia. I think there is a difference between Egypt and Saudi Arabia when it comes to Iran. Saudi Arabia was very anxious that the Muslim Brotherhood would reconcile with Iran, but I think it's deeper than that for Egypt, Iran just isn't a direct security threat in the way that it seems to Saudi Arabia. They don't have that kind of enmity. They don't really see Iran threatening them internally in the way that Saudi Arabia has. So there is a difference when it comes to how they perceive the main, what Saudi Arabia sees as the main problem. And that also is borne out by their different attitudes towards Syria, where the Egyptian army hasn't supported regime change, or their different attitudes to Russia, where Egypt is getting closer and closer to Russia, and Saudi Arabia wants to deal with it, but not, totally side with it on everything. So I think it's a complex relationship, but they do need each other. Finally, I think Egypt has also come to realise that, the Gulf countries can help, but they're not going to repeatedly bail it out. Its economy is too big to keep being bailed out, and the Gulf countries also want Egypt to be more economically self-reliant. So Egypt still needs the economic support of Western countries and multilaterals.
Kristen, we'll let you have the last question.
Thank you. Just one thought or observation on Deborah Jones' question, because I think probably the parallel to what the Kuwaitis are trying to do on the, with the Kuwaitis, you're rightly saying that they're very much now looking at this island development and looking towards Iraq again, and maybe even Iran as their strength in the Northern Gulf. The parallel on the Saudi side is right before our eyes. I think we're just not taking it seriously, and that is they really are talking about Neom and this kind of new Red Sea development that's linked to Jordan and Egypt as being their new kind of city where they would have this new kind of economic development. I mean, I think that's really where their energy is thinking in terms of new areas. And then obviously the kind of development they're thinking about in terms of tourism and religious tourism and using their status as having Mecca and Medina to develop more of that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're even talking about, like, you can get your alcohol from Egypt. It's going to be this one city. I mean, it's all very speculative, but there you go. Tell us how you feel about Neom, but it's interesting, but they talk very seriously. I mean, they seem very enthusiastic about it. So I wanted to ask you about the Iran question, since you brought it up. I mean, we just had some significant changes in the U.S. administration that everyone is interpreting as going to be taking a much harder line. How strongly do you see the Saudi appetite for confrontation with Iran, not just on strengthening, but maybe even pushing towards some kind of military action? I'm just wondering what you think about that appetite.
Well, I think Saudi Arabia would like to see somebody else fix its problems with Iran. Ultimately, I think there was a lot of excitement in Saudi Arabia when Trump came out with the so-called Iran strategy last year, which I say so-called because it didn't actually have any steps to explain how you would get to the goals of changing Iranian behaviour. But I think there may have been an overestimation in Riyadh of the idea that the US has got a plan to change Iranian behaviour. And so far, it doesn't seem like there has been that. I think the Saudi position on the nuclear deal is a little bit complex because Saudi Arabia officially welcomed the deal itself. What they complained about was that they felt because they complained about the process, that they hadn't been included, but also that the deal didn't include anything about their concerns, which were about Iran's regional behaviour and not so much about nuclear weapons. They felt that Iran interpreted the deal as a free pass to get more involved in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. And so that their problem with the deal was what it didn't include and the side effects that it produced, but not specifically the idea of having a non-proliferation deal with Iran. So if the US pulls out of the deal, I also don't see that it will necessarily advance Saudi interests because it's not clear what next steps would be to actually addressing any of the Iranian regional behaviour that the Saudis and others in the region are so concerned about. I think there are all sorts of risks of escalation around a scenario where the deal collapses, especially if Iran blames Saudi Arabia and the UAE for the breakdown. And there's a lot more that could happen in terms of escalation with the Houthi missiles, or strings that Iran could pull in the Gulf itself. So there's a lot of very worrying scenarios, and that's why in Europe a lot of the focus now is on, of course, trying to save the deal, but also figuring out whether the deal could continue without the US, which would be a fascinating development for world politics if such a deal could survive without the US. But what would be ways to try to bind Iran into still having an interest in being seen as a semi-responsible actor? The Israeli position is also very hard to read because Netanyahu obviously has lobbied very hard against the deal, but you have quite a lot of voices in the military and security establishment in Israel who think this is better than nothing, and this at least gives the world a chance to get kind of unprecedented access to Iran's nuclear sites and so forth. Should it fall apart, and should Israel think that that Iran may be returning to a nuclear program, which isn't an inevitable consequence of the deal falling apart, but is one possibility, I think they'd return to their previous strategy of covert and cyber attacks to try to kind of physically stop the Iranian program progressing. And we might see also Iran indulging in more of those attacks, which, you know, it's already been carrying out against Gulf targets in a time of relative peace, but is one of the ways that it could seek to hurt Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
I think we've sort of ended on a note of, you know, enormous political risk, but also, you know, really a vision of how there are multiple challenges to Saudi Arabia's objectives for economic growth, and the U.S. is one of those challenges, as is you know, many political changes going on around us. So please join me in thanking Jane for being with us, and thank all of you for your insightful questions and comments. We really wanted this to be a discussion, and I think it was successful in that way. And you're welcome to stay for coffee and breakfast and continue your conversations without the internet joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.